What no one wants to hear about marriage and gender. Marriage and gender are topics that touch the very core of who we are as human beings. They shape our families, our communities, and even the way we see the world. Yet, in today's culture, there are truths about marriage and gender that few people want to hear. Truths that challenge popular opinion, social trends, and even personal comfort. Billy Graham and Franklin Graham, two of the most respected voices in modern Christianity, spoke clearly and courageously about these truths. They remind us that marriage is more than a social contract, and gender is more than a personal preference. It is a design set by God for our well-being and for the stability of society. Billy Graham often said that the family is the cornerstone of society. Without strong, godly families, communities falter, and nations lose their moral direction. Marriage, according to him, was intended by God to be a lifelong union between a man and a woman based on love, respect, and commitment. This is not merely a tradition or a cultural norm. It is a design that has stood the test of time for a reason. Franklin Graham carries this same message today, warning that when society begins to redefine marriage or ignore God's design for gender, the consequences are profound and far-reaching. One of the first things they emphasize is the importance of commitment. In a world where instant gratification and temporary feelings dominate, staying committed to your spouse is considered old-fashioned or even restrictive. But the Grahams teach that commitment is the bedrock of marriage. It is the promise to stand by someone in joy and in sorrow, in health and in sickness, for a lifetime. This commitment is not optional. It is essential for raising children in a stable environment, for creating a home where love and trust flourish, and for modeling God's faithfulness to the next generation. Marriage is not just about the relationship between two people. It is about how this relationship reflects God's design. A husband and wife complement each other in ways that bring balance and purpose to life. Billy Graham often explained that men and women were created with different strengths and roles, not to dominate or oppress, but to support and nurture one another. When these roles are disregarded or ignored, it can lead to confusion, frustration, and a breakdown of the family unit. Franklin Graham echoes this sentiment, stressing that understanding and respecting God's design for gender is crucial for healthy relationships and thriving families. The Grahams are also clear about the dangers of trying to redefine marriage or gender to fit personal preference or cultural trends. When society shifts the meaning of marriage to include arrangements outside God's design, such as casual partnerships or redefined gender roles, it is not merely a personal choice. It affects everyone. Children grow up without clear examples of stable relationships. Communities face moral decay. Even adults suffer emotional and spiritual consequences when the structure God designed is undermined. Billy Graham often cited statistics showing that children from broken homes are more likely to struggle with education, relationships, and personal identity. Franklin Graham warns that these trends are not neutral. They are symptoms of a society turning away from God's wisdom. Another key point they make is about identity. Understanding who you are in God's eyes is essential. Gender is part of that identity, not a flexible option to be chosen on a whim. Billy Graham would say that God created each person with a purpose, and this purpose includes understanding yourself as male or female. When people ignore this divine design, they risk confusion, insecurity, and relational instability. Franklin Graham has repeatedly emphasized that clarity about gender leads to clarity in life, marriage, and parenting. It is not about oppression. It is about living according to the truth that brings freedom and peace. The Grahams also speak about the influence of media and culture. Movies, television, and social media often glorify casual relationships, instant pleasure, and rejection of traditional roles. Billy Graham warned that consuming these messages without discernment can distort understanding of marriage and gender. Franklin Graham takes it further, noting that when these cultural messages dominate, they shape children's perceptions, influence young adults, and erode the moral fabric of society. They call on parents to be vigilant, to teach their children God's truth, and to model a healthy marriage themselves. Discipline, accountability, and communication are other pillars emphasized by the Grahams. A marriage that honors God requires effort, patience, and forgiveness. Billy Graham often said that pride and selfishness are the greatest enemies of a lasting marriage. Franklin Graham adds that ignoring these spiritual truths leads to resentment, division, and even divorce. Couples who rely on God's guidance, pray together, and maintain open communication are far more likely to thrive. Marriage is not easy, but it is worth it. Both Grahams also address the issue of temptation. The world constantly presents opportunities to compromise marital commitment or to blur the lines of gender understanding. Billy Graham reminded couples to guard their hearts, to flee from situations that could lead to sin, and to build a marriage that honors God above personal desire. Franklin Graham warns that abandoning God's standards opens the door to disappointment, broken trust, and long-term pain. Resisting temptation is not about restriction. It is about protecting something sacred. Parenting is deeply connected to marriage and gender in their teachings. Children learn about love, respect, and responsibility primarily from their parents' example. Billy Graham emphasized that children benefit immensely when they see their parents honoring God's design, loving one another, and fulfilling their respective roles. Franklin Graham reiterates that when parents understand and embrace God's plan for marriage and gender, they provide a stable foundation for their children to grow into healthy, confident, and morally grounded adults. They also challenge the modern idea that happiness in marriage comes from self-fulfillment alone. Billy Graham often reminded audiences that marriage is about serving one another, sacrificing for each other, and putting God at the center. Franklin Graham points out that when couples prioritize God and the well-being of each other over selfish desires, their marriages not only survive but thrive. Happiness is a byproduct of commitment, obedience, and love, not a goal in itself. The Grahams affirm in their message that society's confusion about marriage and gender is not simply a cultural issue. It is a spiritual one. Departing from God's plan leads to broken families, confused identities, and moral decline. Billy Graham often said that the solution is not more laws or policies, but a return to biblical truth. Franklin Graham continues this call, urging families to embrace God's guidance, to pray together, and to live in a way that reflects God's design in everyday life. Even in the face of opposition, both Grahams remain compassionate, yet uncompromising. They recognize that many people struggle with their understanding of gender and marriage. They do not preach condemnation without hope. Billy Graham often concluded sermons with an invitation to turn to God, to seek forgiveness, and to allow God's design to restore families and identities. Franklin Graham emphasizes that change is always possible through faith, prayer, and commitment to God's principles. They also address the role of community and church support. A marriage cannot thrive in isolation. Billy Graham encouraged couples to engage with their church, to seek mentorship, and to be accountable to godly friends. Franklin Graham stresses that churches must provide guidance, resources, and encouragement to families facing cultural pressure, identity confusion, or relational challenges. Together, the church community and the couple create an environment where God's design for marriage and gender can flourish. A recurring theme in both Graham's teachings is courage. It takes courage to uphold God's truth in a world that questions, mocks, or even attacks it. Courage is required to honor the commitments of marriage, to embrace the roles of husband and wife, and to stand firm in the face of cultural pressure. Billy Graham's legacy shows that courage combined with humility changes lives. Franklin Graham demonstrates that courage combined with action and advocacy can influence families, communities, and nations. Finally, both Grahams remind us that marriage and gender are sacred, not social experiments. God's design provides stability, identity, and purpose. Rejecting this design may seem liberating in the short term, but it brings long-term consequences. Upholding it requires dedication, love, and reliance on God. They call families to remember that marriage is a gift, that gender is part of God's plan, and that living according to these truths brings freedom, joy, and lasting impact. The Graham's message is clear. Do not settle for cultural trends or personal preference. Look to God, understand His design, commit to your spouse, embrace your identity, and build a home that reflects truth. Doing so not only strengthens your family, but also blesses future generations. In a world that seeks to redefine what is natural, what is moral, and what is sacred, standing firm on these truths may not be popular, but it is necessary for the health of families, society, and the soul. Before we continue, if you find this message helpful, please take a moment to give it a like. Sharing this video helps spread the truth about marriage, family, and identity to more people who need it. Marriage and gender are under constant pressure in today's society. Every day, families face challenges that previous generations could hardly imagine. Billy Graham and Franklin Graham consistently warned that these challenges are not just social, they are deeply spiritual. Understanding God's design and holding firmly to His principles is not optional. It is essential for the survival of families, for the health of children, and for the moral foundation of society. One area they emphasize is the impact of popular culture. Television shows, movies, music, and social media often glorify self-centered relationships, redefine gender roles, and challenge traditional marriage. Billy Graham observed that young people raised in environments saturated with these messages are more likely to question God's design and embrace confusion about identity and commitment. Franklin Graham builds on this, pointing out that when children and teens internalize these messages, they often enter adulthood with a distorted understanding of marriage, gender, and family responsibilities. The Grahams also focus on the role of the husband in marriage. According to them, a husband's leadership is not about domination, but about responsibility, protection, and love. Billy Graham repeatedly taught that men are called to lead with humility, serve with love, and sacrifice for the good of their family. Franklin Graham emphasizes that when men abandon these responsibilities, the family structure begins to weaken, creating gaps in emotional, spiritual, and moral guidance. A husband who embraces God's design sets a strong example for children and encourages his spouse to thrive. Equally important is the role of the wife. Billy Graham emphasized that a wife's support, encouragement, and care are crucial to a healthy marriage. Women were created to complement men, bringing balance, insight, and nurturing into the home. Franklin Graham stresses that when women embrace their God-given roles without feeling oppressed, they can achieve fulfillment while strengthening the family. The partnership between husband and wife, based on respect and shared commitment, is a model of divine design that reflects God's love to the world. The Grahams are clear about the consequences of ignoring God's design. Couples who disregard the biblical model often experience conflict, dissatisfaction, and relational breakdown. Children raised in such environments may struggle with identity, discipline, and understanding of love. Billy Graham highlighted that the stability of the home directly influences the stability of the community. Franklin Graham adds that societal issues, such as rising divorce rates and moral confusion, are a reflection of broken homes and neglected responsibilities. Communication is another cornerstone. Both Grahams teach that a marriage cannot thrive without open, honest, and respectful communication. Couples must learn to listen, empathize, and express themselves in ways that honor each other. Billy Graham pointed out that many conflicts arise from pride, unspoken expectations, and failure to forgive. Franklin Graham stresses that teaching children how to communicate with love and clarity is just as important as guiding them morally. Strong marriages produce strong families, which in turn produce strong communities. Another central theme is discipline and guidance for children. Billy Graham was firm that children learn most about God, love, and morality by observing their parents. A father who leads with integrity and a mother who nurtures with wisdom creates an environment where children internalize God's values naturally. Franklin Graham reinforces this, emphasizing that children raised with clarity about gender and marital roles are more confident, responsible, and morally grounded. A lack of guidance leads to confusion, insecurity, and susceptibility to cultural influences that contradict God's design. Temptation is also addressed. The Grahams warn that temptation comes in many forms: infidelity, pride, selfishness, or societal pressure to redefine marriage and gender. Billy Graham reminded couples to guard their hearts, to flee from situations that might lead to sin, and to maintain accountability to God and each other. Franklin Graham extends this, pointing out that failing to confront temptation leads to long-term emotional, spiritual, and relational damage. Protecting the sanctity of marriage requires vigilance, prayer, and deliberate action. They also explore the connection between faith and family health. A marriage grounded in God's word is resilient against cultural pressure, conflict, and moral decay. Billy Graham consistently taught that couples who pray together, attend church, and live according to biblical principles experience greater intimacy, joy, and stability. Franklin Graham emphasizes that faith is not private. It shapes every decision, interaction, and choice in family life. Strong faith strengthens identity, clarifies gender roles, and empowers couples to overcome challenges. Both Grahams address the modern challenge of confusion about gender identity. They affirm that understanding oneself as male or female is not arbitrary. It is part of God's design for life, relationships, and family. Billy Graham highlighted that children and adults alike need clarity about their identity to thrive emotionally, spiritually, and socially. Franklin Graham stresses that societal pressures to blur or redefine gender create unnecessary confusion, conflict, and vulnerability. Upholding God's design brings security, purpose, and alignment with divine truth. The Grahams also talk about sacrificial love. Marriage is not primarily about personal happiness. It is about serving, supporting, and honoring one another. Billy Graham illustrated this with countless examples of couples who persevered through challenges, forgave each other, and prioritized their spouse's well-being over selfish desires. Franklin Graham emphasizes that a culture obsessed with self-fulfillment undermines this principle. Yet couples who embrace sacrificial love experience deeper connection and lasting satisfaction. Accountability within the marriage and in the broader community is another key point. Billy Graham recommended seeking guidance from spiritual mentors, trusted friends, and church leaders to maintain perspective and integrity. Franklin Graham echoes this, noting that isolation makes families vulnerable to moral confusion, temptation, and cultural pressure. Accountability provides support, correction, and encouragement that strengthen marriages and reinforce God's design. Both Grahams also confront the temptation of convenience and compromise. In today's fast-paced world, it is easy to abandon commitment, ignore roles, or redefine relationships for temporary ease or social approval. Billy Graham warned that every compromise has a cost: emotional, relational, and spiritual. Franklin Graham emphasizes that cultural approval does not equate to truth. Living according to God's design may be unpopular, but it preserves integrity, identity, and the family unit. Another point they emphasize is preparation and education for marriage. Couples benefit from understanding their roles, learning effective communication, and embracing God's design before entering marriage. Billy Graham taught that preparation prevents misunderstandings, conflict, and heartache. Franklin Graham emphasizes that preparation also safeguards children, reinforces identity, and strengthens moral foundations. A well-prepared marriage is resilient against societal pressures and personal challenges. They also warn about the influence of extended family and friends. Supportive networks strengthen marriages. Toxic or permissive influences can erode them. Billy Graham encouraged couples to surround themselves with those who respect God's design, provide wise counsel, and reinforce moral clarity. Franklin Graham notes that children absorb these values from their environment, so selecting positive influences is crucial for long-term family health. The Grahams consistently stress personal responsibility. Marriage and family thrive when each person honors their role, remains accountable to God, and actively works to nurture the relationship. Billy Graham taught that neglecting responsibility leads to disappointment, frustration, and relational decay. Franklin Graham reminds us that personal effort, guided by faith and obedience, is indispensable for building lasting marriages and confident children. Finally, both Grahams call families to boldness and courage. Standing for God's design in a culture that questions, mocks, or rejects it requires courage. Billy Graham exemplified this by preaching truth with gentleness and conviction. Franklin Graham demonstrates that courage combined with action, prayer, guidance, and advocacy can strengthen families, protect children, and preserve the moral fabric of society. Upholding God's design for marriage and gender may be countercultural, but it is vital for lasting impact and spiritual health. Marriage and gender are not just personal matters, they ripple through every part of society. Billy Graham often reminded audiences that the health of a nation begins in the home. Families that honor God's design produce citizens who understand responsibility, respect, and moral clarity. Franklin Graham expands on this, warning that when families collapse under cultural pressure, society suffers. Higher divorce rates, broken communities, and confusion about personal identity become the norm. These are not abstract issues. They are visible, measurable, and increasingly urgent in today's world. A critical theme both Grahams emphasize is honesty within marriage. Couples must speak truthfully, not just about finances or schedules, but about feelings, fears, and faith. Billy Graham pointed out that dishonesty, even in small matters, creates a foundation of mistrust that grows over time. Franklin Graham adds that open, consistent communication aligns couples with God's design, making it easier to resolve conflict and navigate life's challenges. Children raised in homes where honesty and transparency are modeled grow up with a sense of security, moral clarity, and respect for truth. Respect is another cornerstone. Billy Graham taught that husbands and wives should honor one another in every word, deed, and decision. Franklin Graham reinforces that respect is not passive, it is active. It shows in how couples support each other, how they make joint decisions, and how they protect each other from harm. A marriage without respect becomes a battlefield. A marriage with respect becomes a sanctuary. Children learn respect not from lectures, but from watching their parents treat each other with care and dignity. The Grahams also highlight the importance of forgiveness. No one is perfect, and every marriage will face mistakes, misunderstandings, and failures. Billy Graham often said that forgiving quickly and sincerely restores trust and strengthens bonds. Franklin Graham emphasizes that lingering resentment can poison a marriage and confuse children about what love really means. Forgiveness is not optional. It is a practical application of God's grace in family life. Both Grahams stress shared faith as a glue for marriage. Couples who pray together, attend church together, and discuss God's word regularly build a spiritual connection that sustains them through trials. Billy Graham explained that when God is at the center, love deepens, patience grows, and the family becomes resilient. Franklin Graham insists that a faith-centered marriage also protects children, clarifies identity, and strengthens moral judgment. Without this foundation, families risk being swept away by cultural trends and personal desires. Another vital teaching is about role modeling for children. Billy Graham often said that children learn morality, gender identity, and relational skills primarily by observing their parents. Franklin Graham echoes this point, noting that when children witness obedience to God, respect between husband and wife, and clear gender roles, they internalize values that guide them throughout life. A lack of modeling leads to confusion, instability, and vulnerability to cultural pressures. The Grahams also address the challenge of societal pressure. Popular media and peer influence often promote ideas contrary to God's design. Billy Graham warned that exposure to these messages without guidance undermines marriage and family stability. Franklin Graham points out that standing firm against these pressures requires courage, conviction, and a clear understanding of biblical truth. Parents who teach their children to discern culture through God's lens provide protection and clarity in an otherwise confusing world. Temptation, both internal and external, is a recurring concern. Billy Graham reminded couples that the heart must be guarded. Desires left unchecked can erode commitment and marital integrity. Franklin Graham emphasizes accountability, not hiding flaws, but addressing them openly, with prayer and spiritual support. Couples who actively guard their hearts and homes resist compromise, maintain fidelity, and demonstrate God's design in action. The Grahams are also clear about the consequences of neglecting God's principles. Broken homes, confused identities, and moral compromise are predictable results of ignoring divine guidance. Billy Graham often cited research showing that children from stable, faith-centered homes fare better emotionally, socially, and spiritually. Franklin Graham emphasizes that societal trends toward redefining marriage and gender are not neutral experiments. They produce measurable harm and confusion over time. Both Grahams advocate intentional parenting. Children must be guided in understanding roles, respecting authority, and embracing moral clarity. Billy Graham noted that parents who neglect this responsibility often see children struggle with identity, purpose, and moral decision-making. Franklin Graham stresses that intentional parenting includes teaching biblical truth, modeling respect, and actively engaging children in spiritual growth. Doing so equips the next generation to uphold God's design in marriage and gender. They also stress the importance of humility and service. Marriage is a partnership that requires putting the other's needs above one's own desires. Billy Graham repeatedly illustrated that couples who serve each other selflessly create stronger, more enduring relationships. Franklin Graham reinforces that cultural messages encouraging self-centeredness undermine marital health. True strength in marriage comes from humility, sacrifice, and shared purpose, not personal gratification or social approval. The Grahams address the spiritual dimensions of conflict. Every family faces disagreements, but unresolved conflict can grow into bitterness and division. Billy Graham taught that couples should approach conflict with prayer, patience, and a willingness to see the other's perspective. Franklin Graham highlights that ignoring God's guidance in resolving conflict leads to relational damage that may last generations. Peace and unity in the home are nurtured by faith, humility, and accountability. Another point they emphasize is the long-term view of marriage. In a culture focused on instant results and fleeting emotions, Billy Graham reminds couples that marriage is a lifelong journey requiring perseverance. Franklin Graham stresses that investing in marriage has a ripple effect. It shapes children, influences the community, and upholds moral standards in society. Couples who understand this long-term perspective make decisions that reflect commitment, integrity, and foresight. Both Grahams also discuss the dangers of isolation. Couples who disconnect from community, church, or supportive mentors are more vulnerable to temptation, confusion, and moral compromise. Billy Graham encouraged engagement with spiritually mature friends, small groups, and church leaders. Franklin Graham reinforces that accountability and guidance provide protection and clarity, helping families navigate societal pressures while maintaining fidelity to God's design. They emphasize clarity in gender roles. Understanding and embracing God-given differences between men and women is essential. Billy Graham taught that these differences are not about superiority or limitation. They are complementary, designed to balance and strengthen relationships. Franklin Graham highlights that cultural attempts to blur gender distinctions often create confusion, relational strain, and identity struggles. Clarity in roles fosters respect, stability, and purpose in the home. Finally, the Grahams consistently call for action rooted in faith. Knowledge of God's design is not enough. It must be lived daily. Billy Graham taught that prayer, obedience, and sacrificial love are essential for strong marriages and healthy families. Franklin Graham emphasizes that applying these principles publicly, boldly, and consistently creates lasting impact. upholding God's truth about marriage and gender is a responsibility that protects families, strengthens communities, and honors God. As we reflect on these teachings, it becomes clear that marriage and gender are not mere social constructs. They are sacred, divinely designed, and foundational to the health of individuals, families, and society. Billy Graham's wisdom reminds us of God's eternal truth, while Franklin Graham challenges us to apply it courageously in a world that often resists it. Together, they provide a roadmap for families seeking clarity, purpose, and strength in an era of uncertainty and confusion. If you found these insights meaningful, please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Your perspective matters, and it helps create a conversation about the importance of God's design in marriage and gender. As we move forward, it is crucial to understand that the truths about marriage and gender are not optional. They are lifelines. Billy Graham taught that families are the building blocks of society, and Franklin Graham emphasizes that when those blocks are weakened, the effects ripple outward, affecting communities, culture, and even nations. Living according to God's design provides stability, clarity, and purpose, while ignoring it leads to confusion, moral compromise, and relational breakdown. One of the most important aspects of strong marriages is intentional commitment. Billy Graham described marriage as a covenant, not just an emotional connection or a legal contract. Franklin Graham underscores that commitment is the backbone of family health, requiring daily choices to love, forgive, and uphold responsibilities. This commitment extends beyond the couple, influencing children, relatives, and even broader communities. When a husband and wife uphold this covenant, they model trust, reliability, and faithfulness, qualities that are desperately needed in a world filled with fleeting relationships. The Grahams also focus on embracing God-given roles. Men and women were created with unique strengths and purposes that complement one another. Billy Graham often highlighted that the husband's role is to lead with humility and love, while the wife's role is to support, nurture, and guide the family with wisdom. Franklin Graham stresses that understanding and embracing these roles brings balance, clarity, and strength to marriages. Ignoring these roles, they warn, creates tension, confusion, and relational struggles. God's design is not restrictive, it is protective, providing a blueprint for flourishing. A cornerstone of their teachings is the moral and spiritual responsibility of parents. Children learn morality, identity, and relational skills primarily through observation. Billy Graham often said that parents' actions speak louder than words. Franklin Graham reinforces this, explaining that children internalize the respect, obedience, and moral clarity they witness at home. A home where gender roles and marital responsibilities are clear and honored equips children to thrive, reducing confusion about identity, relationships, and purpose. Both Grahams emphasize the dangers of societal influence. Television, movies, social media, and peer pressure often promote values that contradict God's design. Billy Graham cautioned that unfiltered exposure to these messages weakens family bonds and distorts understanding of marriage and gender. Franklin Graham points out that families must actively engage with culture from a place of discernment, teaching children to evaluate trends, messages, and behaviors through God's truth. This active guidance protects families from moral confusion and helps children form stable identities rooted in divine wisdom. Communication is another pillar of strong families. Couples must cultivate open, honest, and respectful dialogue. Billy Graham taught that expressing feelings, concerns, and hopes fosters intimacy and prevents resentment. Franklin Graham emphasizes that children benefit from witnessing such communication, learning how to express themselves, resolve conflicts, and interact respectfully. Clear communication is not a luxury. It is a necessity for the health and longevity of marriages and families. Forgiveness and grace are equally vital. Every marriage encounters challenges, disappointments, and failures. Billy Graham consistently taught that forgiveness restores trust and strengthens bonds. Franklin Graham emphasizes that withholding forgiveness erodes relationships and sets a damaging example for children. Living with grace allows couples to navigate conflict, overcome mistakes, and model God's unconditional love to their families. The Grahams are firm about standing against cultural redefinition of marriage and gender. Franklin Graham often points out that societal pressure to accept alternative definitions creates instability, confusion, and long-term emotional harm. Billy Graham emphasized that God's design is timeless, providing order, purpose, and stability. Upholding these truths may be unpopular, but it protects families and safeguards future generations. Both Grahams also discuss the importance of prayer and spiritual discipline. A couple that prays together, studies scripture together, and seeks God's guidance in daily decisions fortifies their marriage against challenges and temptation. Billy Graham highlighted that spiritual unity strengthens emotional and relational bonds. Franklin Graham underscores that when families are rooted in God, they can withstand societal pressures, moral confusion, and relational stress. Faith is not a side activity. It is the foundation upon which healthy marriages and families are built. Another critical lesson is preparing children for life. Billy Graham taught that children raised in homes that honor God's design develop resilience, clarity, and moral strength. Franklin Graham stresses that parents must actively engage in their children's moral and spiritual education, guiding them in understanding identity, respect, and responsibility. This preparation equips children to navigate a world filled with conflicting messages about marriage, gender, and morality. Both Grahams emphasize the role of community. A couple does not thrive in isolation. Billy Graham encouraged engagement with spiritually mature mentors, supportive friends, and church leaders. Franklin Graham reinforces that community accountability, guidance, and support are essential for navigating modern pressures, maintaining clarity in roles, and preserving moral integrity. Community strengthens families and amplifies the impact of living according to God's design. Courage is a recurring theme. Standing firm in God's truth about marriage and gender requires bravery. Billy Graham demonstrated courage by preaching biblical truth with gentleness and wisdom. Franklin Graham exemplifies courage by confronting cultural trends and challenging norms that contradict God's design. Courage, combined with humility and faith, allows families to remain steadfast in an increasingly skeptical and confusing world. The Grahams also teach that sacrificial love is the key to lasting marriage. True love is not self-serving. It prioritizes the needs, growth, and well-being of one's spouse. Billy Graham consistently illustrated that couples who serve each other and model God's love experience deeper intimacy and stability. Franklin Graham emphasizes that this principle protects children, nurtures healthy relationships, and upholds moral standards. Sacrificial love is not a burden. It is the path to genuine fulfillment and family flourishing. They address the consequences of moral compromise. Ignoring God's design in marriage and gender may seem convenient or culturally acceptable, but it leads to relational breakdown, identity confusion, and societal instability. Billy Graham pointed out that broken homes produce long-term challenges for children and communities. Franklin Graham warns that these trends, if left unchecked, create a cycle of confusion and conflict that affects multiple generations. Upholding God's truth, even when unpopular, protects families, children, and society as a whole. Both Grahams stress the importance of clarity and intentionality in relationships. Every decision about communication, roles, boundaries, or discipline affects the health of the marriage and the well-being of children. Billy Graham urged couples to make conscious, faith-based choices that align with God's design. Franklin Graham emphasizes that intentionality protects families from cultural confusion and moral drift, creating homes that reflect God's truth. Finally, they call families to action, reflection, and perseverance. Understanding God's design is not enough. It must be implemented daily. Prayer, accountability, sacrificial love, and clarity about roles are essential. Billy Graham's teachings inspire families to embrace God's design with humility and consistency. Franklin Graham challenges families to boldly defend and live out these truths, ensuring that their homes remain strong, their children secure, and their communities blessed. Marriage and gender, when honored according to God's design, provide a foundation of stability, clarity, and purpose. Families that embrace these truths create a legacy of faith, integrity, and moral strength. In a world that often rejects divine wisdom, standing firm may be difficult, but the rewards are eternal. Upholding God's design in marriage and gender protects families, nurtures children, and strengthens society. If this message resonated with you, please leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, experiences, or reflections. Your voice can encourage others to embrace God's design for marriage, gender, and family, helping to build a stronger, more faithful community for generations to come.